sustainability goals are. So it's important to begin to get alignment around those two things. Think of that as net positive advocacy on the policy front. That's really important for system change too, right? To change public policy in a way that makes it more consistent with and pulls us.
So,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
Chris,
I feel this kind of I when I think about conscious, I think about ethics and I think about humans as a human being to do good and to be a ethical person, to just be the real you. If we do everything with our heart and things couldn't go wrong. So that's what I'm really advocating today. And it's really building up in the society how our mental health has been heavily impacted by the corporate culture from the past and everything around it. It's a turning point to me. How do we deal with the culture in the corporate world and how do people really feel about the system? And the virtual, it's really, really important and it's really, really hard to reach. But there's simple steps that we can take, just become, being a real person and to treat each other with respect. But I'll be very blunt, it's really hard to see, especially the bigger the organization is. And I find it hard to really build that human connection to make good things happen. It's about a lot of rules and coldness and just, yeah. Stu, you're writing this conscious capitalism. I'm sure you have your thoughts on that as well. Besides, the kind of corporate system talking how to do good environment. I think it all comes back to us as a human being.
Oh, totally. I mean, again, we're back to the idea of that shareholder primacy really serves one stakeholder, which is those that own stock in the company. Whereas, so we can trot out the term stakeholder capitalism. It's popular these days, uh, but I think that's part of the larger construct that I would think of as what I call sustainable capitalism, right? The reason that it's difficult for such companies to thrive in today's world, those companies that actually seek to foster, that people get to bring their whole selves to work and to kind of realize their larger purpose as people, is because they're not really considered a priority, in terms of the purpose of the company, right? So as long as the operating system for capitalism is shareholder primacy based, those things can never flourish, right? That way of thinking can never flourish. But my point is, by looking back through history, it hasn't always been that way, and it need not continue to be that way, right? That shareholder primacy is not preordained. It may have been the source code, but we've made a couple of different attempts to try to blunt it in the past. And I think we're now at a point in world history where we have to actually figure out how to fix it for once and for all, right? We need genetic modification of capitalism. I think of it as CRISPR for capitalism. There are some really bad genes in capitalism that just simply have to be removed at this point in time. We've been able to blunt the effect of it briefly in the past with these reformations I've talked about, but it's always come back again. We're now at a point where we can't really afford for that to happen anymore because the impacts are at the world scale, right? They are existential impacts that we're experiencing. So, I think what you're saying, Isabella, is just one of the elements that a truly sustainable form of capitalism would allow businesses to actually enable its people, its employees to become a priority, that they would be rewarded for creating workplaces that allow people to realize their full purpose. That becomes one of the important elements of a sustainable business. That the idea of short-term profits to drive share price must give way to a redefinition of what value itself means, right? We've been convinced, and it's been largely business schools that have done this over the last 40 years, myself being complicit in this. I've been a business school professor for 40 years almost, right? Since the mid 80s. I watched this happen, right? Business schools were taken over by the logic of shareholder primacy. It started with the Chicago School of Economics and spread, right? Financial economics became the dominant perspective in business schools. The mantra of maximizing shareholder wealth became the meme, right? It became the purpose of business and business education. So business education, business schools, MBA programs have brainwashed generations of people into believing that this is what the purpose of business is. They now are senior people on Wall Street, in investment firms, in private equity firms, in consulting firms, in corporations. And it's so the idea that profit maximization, quarterly earnings growth as the main driver of share price is a social construction. It's just a story that has been perpetrated on us. It's the underpinning of this era of shareholder capitalism, but there's nothing preordained about it. We can simply decide to change the story, change the narrative. You think about it, public equity markets are nothing more than trading markets. 50 years ago, if you look at the New York Stock Exchange, maybe 30% of its transactions were new investment, IPOs and new issues. Now, because of financial deregulation in the 80s and 90s, and the emergence and explosion of the derivatives markets, new issues are less than 1% of what, say, New York Stock Exchange does, right? 99% is trading. And if you even look at the new investments like IPOs are maybe 300 billion a year, and whereas share buybacks are 1 trillion. So share buybacks swamp new issues. So public equity markets are actually investment negative. They extract capital. And if that's the case, if they're purely trading markets, then we can decide that it could be anything that we think should be the driver of share price. There's nothing sacred about quarterly earnings growth. Why shouldn't reinvestment rate drive share price? Why shouldn't employee living wage drive share price? Why shouldn't footprint reduction drive share? The simple answer is it could. We could decide that any set of factors should be the driver of share price in a purely trading market. But for that to happen, we need a new story to emerge about what the purpose and objective function of capitalism itself is.
Thank you. Great, great. I really love the everything you just shared. For that story to be happen, what do you think it's required? Or do you see it happening? Is it in your book? Sorry, I haven't read it yet. But that's the whole point, right? We're talking about it. Yeah.
It's why I wrote the book. And I think the contribution that I make above and because there's more and more work being done these days, right, around the idea of system change. There are more and more initiatives in that space. If you look at Paul Pullman and Andrew Winston's, newish book called Net Positive, if you're familiar with that, that's a key element, a key point of their book is that business leaders have to become advocates for system change. And there are different elements of that. I think of it as a tree. If you think of the tree as a metaphor, one element of system change is the canopy, and the canopy of the tree, the branches and the fruit, right, are constantly growing and changing, right? They're it's very protein, right? And if you focus your attention on system change as a business leader in the canopy, then you're essentially it's issue management, constantly new issues popping up, right? Just like new branches and fruit growing. And I think that for a lot of companies, that's what they've done. CEOs staking out positions on issue, whether it's DEI or whatever it might be. And I think that's fraught, right? Because first of all, not all issues are directly relevant to every company. And that not, and as they emerge, it's difficult to become deeply knowledgeable about them. So sometimes you get out over your skis, right? As a business leader. So, in addition to some issues are really important, are material to companies. In that case, you probably should be on those, right? Whatever they might be, whether it's, deforestation, if you're in the agriculture business, whatever it might be. But, the trunk of the tree probably is something that as business leaders, and this is what Pullman and Winston focus on. The trunk of the tree is more enduring, right? It's growing, but not as fast. That's sort of the policy elements, right? That's public policy. Becoming what they call net positive advocates for policy change, to align your lobbying with what you say your purpose is. The emerging idea of corporate political responsibility, because for most large companies, what they're lobbying for in the background is diametrically opposed to what they say their purpose is and what their sustainability goals are. So it's important to begin to get alignment around those two things. Think of that as net positive advocacy on the policy front. That's really important for system change too, right? To change public policy in a way that makes it more consistent with and pulls us more rapidly toward a sustainable capitalism and a sustainable world, and allows companies to make those kind of investments more easily. But what I focus on in my book, where I think the contribution is that above and beyond those two things, kind of the canopy and the trunk, is the root system. And the root system I think of as the institutions that enable and define capitalism itself, right? It's the root system that determines how the above ground part of the tree is going to grow. And those institutions, the two that I focus on in the book are, one, business education, because I think business education is one of the root causes of our problem, that unless or until we reinvent business education, we will continue to churn people out into the world that are true believers of shareholder primacy. It's still happening. We're graduating hundreds of thousands of people every year from business schools with MBA degrees that are true believers still, right? So unless or until we transform, reinvent business education, which is something that I've been focused on now for some time, it's hard for me to see how we realize the kind of transformational change we need. And then the other is the financial infrastructure. And I just mentioned public equity markets. It's possible for us to shift the logic of public equity markets. So in my book, I talk about, on the business education front, this new program I've been involved in standing up at the University of Vermont called the Sustainable Innovation MBA. It's a clean sheet redesign, right? Most business schools, I've been at Michigan, UNC, Chapel Hill, Cornell, and started centers in sustainable business, all three places. Most of the sustainability at these schools is what we call saddlebag sustainability. My colleague Sanjay Sharma and I coined that term and wrote a paper about it. In other words, the sustainability stuff just kind of hangs off the side. It's a center for sustainable business. It's second-year elective courses. It doesn't change the core of the program. The first-year core courses are still the same as they were 30 years ago when I started teaching the core strategy course at Michigan. They haven't changed. The sustainability is all loaded into second-year electives that students can take or not take, as the case may be. So, maybe 20% of students in a typical MBA program have some contact with the sustainability challenges. Most don't. They just continue it's still the core curriculum from the 80s. So unless or until we reinvent business education, which we've done at Vermont, the dean there, who is a guy named Sanjay Sharma, abolished the existing MBA program. We started over again and designed a completely new MBA program from scratch. So from start to finish, from orientation till graduation and on to what we call launch, not placement, the entire program is focused on the knowledge, skills, capabilities, and toolkits for creating a sustainable world through business. Whether it's in startups and entrepreneurship, or whether it's corporate transformation, or whether it's sustainable finance and impact investing, or whether it's transformational consulting, that's the purpose of the MBA program. And we see that as a disruptive innovation. Our applications are growing, whereas applications to conventional two-year MBA programs are shrinking. Doesn't matter which program, Harvard Business School's MBA program is experiencing application declines. It's a declining category. That's a healthy sign, right? But what we need is creative destruction of the MBA as we know it. Same thing on the public equity side. I talk in the book, I talk about a startup called the Long-Term Stock Exchange. It was started by a guy named Eric Ries, who's of the lean startup fame, right? If you know that book. He observed that no entrepreneur that he knew that reached the point where they would logically go public wants to go public, because the last thing they want is to turn their company over to a 25-year-old MBA Wall Street analyst telling them how to run it for short-term profit. So most entrepreneurs don't want to take their company public, and that's a shame when you think about it, right? That they're at a point where they could and probably should, but they don't want to do it. So he was motivated by that realization that there's something fundamentally wrong with our public equity markets. So let's start a new one. So he started a new one called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, where its objective function is different. That if you want to be listed on the long-term stock exchange, you must demonstrate a long-term strategy that serves all the stakeholders. If you want to be an investor on the long-term stock exchange, there's no short-term trading. You are of necessity a long-term investor. It has a different set of it has a different operating system and a different purpose and objective function, and that actually is much more healthy. That every B Corp should go public on that platform. The existing corporations that have tried to behave this way that only end up getting punished, think Danone or Unilever, they should list. They can cross list on the long-term stock exchange, then ultimately be solely listed there. These are the kinds of sort of creative destruction moves that need to happen.
And you mentioned creative distraction, a good point for maybe a completely new interview, because this, I think, wrapped around is the principle of creative disruption, which is capitalism. And as you're going through that and the business schools, and I noticed from AKFI as well, from the Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, everybody wants quantitative analysis, and many of these impacts are qualitative. And I hope the new business schools you mentioned, Professor Sharma and so on, will teach actually sustainability from an ethics perspective, sustainability from a renewable perspectives, and so on.
Yeah, well, I think the whole ESG move now has been a bow, an important bow in that direction of quantification, right? That it's about ESG metrics, right? It's a lot of it is ESG analytics and metrics, whether it's the raters or what have you. And I do think that's an important because it's coming more from the finance side. But ultimately, the way I would think about this is that the metrics piece, like I think we fool ourselves into believing that that the metrics, the numbers are hard, whereas the other stuff is soft, right? Qualitative. I actually think it's the reverse, right? That numbers are just an abstraction, right? That the hard stuff is actual, like workers in companies, people in communities that actually experience impacts in their lives. That's hard, right? The
Yeah,
numbers
that's
about return on equity, those are just all abstractions, right? That okay, so we can put a number on it, but they're actually not real impacts, right? They're just abstractions. So we need to actually get to the point where our system of capitalism recognizes the impacts of those other things we consider qualitative now as being the most important, right? And so ESG metrics and analytics, I think, are an important first step, but they're very superficial. Ultimately, it's about what's the mindset and worldview that business people have, and how does that influence the decisions they make? That's what's important. It ultimately becomes the culture.
well. And actually, when we deal with CSG, it's like 80% quantitative, it's E. And when we move toward SNG, we
Yeah,
naturally
exactly.
move toward
Exactly. It's
qualitative
much
because,
harder to come up with simple numbers,
right,
especially for the S, right? Much
yeah,
harder.
yep,
So, environment somehow kind of maybe it gives a false sense of security that we can put a number, on CO2 reduction and waste reduction and so forth. I mean, that's great. We should be doing that, right? But we shouldn't kid ourselves that that's the end game.
Mhm.
absolutely.
Nice. Well, I just realized you answered all the rest of the questions in the flow conversation. That's amazing without even planning it. So, because you talk about, I'm sure I'm correct, you talk about the policies and what are the urgencies for the shift, and how do you envision the futures for government as a what the role they're playing, and how do you see the companies are approaching today's, and also what do you learn from their practices, and also how schools and colleges, schools, they need to practice in the future. So you kind of covered all that, of course, in your book as well, which is amazing. And you've been teaching, you've been deal with business students and professionals, and now probably a lot of them wants to get into sustainability through your program. What has been your advice to them? And I'm curious, like, what hasn't changed your advice from 30 years ago versus now? What's your new piece of wisdom to the students today?
Well, I just think the aperture now is much wider than it was 30 years ago in terms of what was the opportunity horizon for students in a business school that bring this perspective, right? That as I said, 30 years ago, eco-efficiency was really that was the entry portal, right? And so to have an impact in companies, that was really the thing that you could make stick, right? So, but that's a fairly narrow band, right? That tends to be, much more around operations, and so forth, or sourcing, or maybe, product stewardship and marketing and branding and so forth. Now I think, that aperture is much wider. It elevates much more to the role of not just strategy, but also purpose, corporate purpose, and beyond, right? It also elevates to the level of kind of building collaborations and collaboration ecosystems for change out there in the world. So I think and also into the financial sector, right? I think the whole domain of sustainable finance and impact investing has become much wider and deeper than it was 30 years ago. And into the consulting world, right? Where increasingly you see a more transformational form of consulting and practices built around the idea of sustainability now becoming commonplace. So for us, like our program at Vermont, those tend to be our areas of focus for what we call launch, not placement, right? Because conventional two-year MBA programs look to place the lion's share of the graduates from conventional two-year MBA programs are still placed in high-paying jobs in consulting and on Wall Street that just perpetuate the status quo because they pay a lot of money and they can service their debt. Whereas what we need in terms of business schools being transformational is, one, we dramatically reduce the tuition for our MBA program because it's become ridiculously high, so that our students have more degrees of freedom when they finish. It's a one-year program, not a two-year program. So they graduate with a car loan, not a home mortgage. And that allows them more degrees of freedom. And what we try to do is open up our launch process as a structured networking process into opportunity pathways, which we think are corporate transformation, those corporations interested in transformation, into kind of clean tech and regenerative tech venturing and inclusive base of the pyramid venturing, into transformational consulting, and into sustainable finance and impact investing. And then there's the B Corp world too, right? I think so. Like a lot of our students in the Vermont program want to work for a company that already has that DNA, like a B Corp kind of organization. And that's fine, but that's not everybody, right? There are those that want to take on corporations, right? To become, entrepreneurs and sources of transformation. So it really depends on how you're built, what inspires you, and what you want to do.
Thank you. Thank you. Anything to add, Manuel, before we wrap up for today's conversation?
Just another invitation to Stu. Come back.
Well, that's very
Please,
kind.
Stu.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, for taking this time and sharing your insights and also sharing your vision for the future of capitalism, moving away from shareholder primacy and also to wake up our consciousness to develop conscious capitalism, which is much needed in this fast evolving world. And thank you again for taking the time. And thanks to our audience as well. Make sure you tune in every week for a new episode of AKFI's Actionable ESG Talk series, where you can gain new perspective on how to mitigate risk and create value by integrating ESG and digital transformation. Until next week, bye for now. Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.